It began, as these stories so often do, in a cradle surrounded by marble and blood. The infant Charles II of Spain entered the world with the weight of 1,000 years pressing on his chest, only no one knew just how literal that would soon become. Born in 1661, last scion of the Habsburgs of Spain, he was not the product of love or even alliance, but of a long, slow suffocation beneath the velvet canopy of dynastic ambition. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his niece. His grandparents had once been siblings, and their grandparents had played a similar game, each marriage tightening the knot of lineage until the blood itself seemed to beg for mercy. To see him as a child was to glimpse the cost of such lineage, etched into flesh. His tongue was so large he could not speak properly until he was 4. His jaw, famously deformed, jutted like a broken hinge, making even swallowing a challenge. He drooled constantly. His body remained slight and twisted. Servants whispered about his eyes. They said they didn't just look at you, they slid over you like oil on glass. At court, people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But the devil did not make him this way. His ancestors did. Spain had once ruled half the known world. But the Habsburg bloodline had ruled it from within a gilded coffin, sealing themselves tighter with every wedding and child born between uncle and niece. Now the empire itself limped along with the same halting gait as its king. Ministers spoke in grave tones about providence, but behind closed doors, doctors and priests debated what to do with a monarch who could barely walk without assistance, let alone rule. He was 7 when they first feared he might die. He was 12 when they began praying he would. Charles's education was both ceremony and cruelty. Tutors tried Latin. He stared back blankly. They tried philosophy. He fell asleep. Eventually, they resorted to teaching him nothing at all, assuming nature had cursed him too greatly. But in truth, he understood more than they imagined. He learned silence. He learned how to watch. Most of all, he learned how power moved not through intellect but through fear. He may not have inherited his father's mind, but he understood something far older, how to survive by being needed, even if only as a symbol. The court, of course, pretended. They dressed him in armor for parades. He was lifted onto horses by hidden scaffolds. Portraits were commissioned that softened his jaw and brightened his skin. But no oil painting could conceal the truth from foreign ambassadors, who reported home in horrified detail. One French diplomat wrote simply, "His Catholic Majesty is incapable of sustaining the weight of his own name." Yet behind all the whispers, behind the velvet and incense, something else festered. The crown was not just passing through a body, it was becoming trapped in one. The Habsburgs had created a god-king whose flesh was rebelling against its own lineage. They had not killed their dynasty by inbreeding. They had transformed it into something that still breathed, still ruled, but could no longer grow or change. Like a wax figure left too long in the sun, Charles was melting in place. And no one dared extinguish the candle. By his teenage years, Charles II had become less a king and more a riddle, one Spain could no longer afford to solve. Foreign courts mocked him as a specter of decay, but inside Madrid's Alcazar, the mood was far more somber. There was no joy in ruling a dying empire. Only ritual. Only waiting. And for Charles, that waiting stretched into a life of dim corridors, whispered prayers, and constant supervision. He wasn't allowed to sleep alone. The fear, officially, was for his health, but no one trusted him not to die in the night, or worse, to say something that would reveal how little he truly grasped. His body betrayed him daily. He suffered seizures that left him gasping and blank-eyed. His digestion failed regularly, forcing palace cooks to prepare special soups and soft eggs. And through it all, he remained curiously still, as if aware that any sudden motion might shatter whatever illusion of kingship remained. But Charles had one weapon, his presence. As malformed as he was, he remained the last Habsburg. The last piece of a centuries-long game stretching from the Alps to the Americas. That meant he could not be dismissed. He could not be replaced. He had to marry. So the matchmakers were summoned. First came Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV. A golden prize for Spain, if only she could be made to love a man she barely understood. When she arrived at court, she expected a crippled monarch. What she found was far worse, a man-child, slumped and smiling, who tried to embrace her like a frightened boy clutching a doll. She recoiled. The marriage went through regardless. They shared a bed, but not much else. Charles doted on her with pathetic affection. He gifted her trinkets, animals, prayers. She gave him silence. Rumors swirled, he was sterile, he was cursed, he was not even a man. Charles, for his part, grew obsessed. He followed her like a shadow. When she fell ill, he wept uncontrollably, as though mourning the only flicker of warmth his world had known. She died at 26. Some said it was poison. Others said it was despair. Charles blamed himself, praying aloud at her grave and swearing he would never love again. But his advisors had no room for sentiment. The dynasty still had no heir. And so the search began again. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen for her fertile family history, 12 siblings, all healthy. But she too found herself imprisoned in a role no one envied, producing a child with a man whose body fought nature itself. She tried. God knows, she tried. But every effort ended in failure. The court grew more anxious. Whispers turned to schemes. Foreign powers circled like wolves. And Charles, once a figure of ridicule, became something else entirely, a bottleneck through which history could not pass. By now, he had developed a superstitious terror of death. He ordered endless exorcisms, believing himself bewitched. He had corpses dug up and reburied. He consulted mystics, prayed compulsively, and once kept a dead friar's heart in his chambers as protection. His sleep was filled with visions. In one dream, he claimed the Virgin Mary warned him of betrayal from within. He awoke screaming and ordered the palace searched. The irony, of course, was cruel. Charles, the man most protected by power, had become its most terrified servant. He saw ghosts in every corner, curses in every mirror. But the true curse, the one no priest could lift, was written in his DNA, forged by centuries of pride disguised as purity. And while the ministers debated and alliances shifted, Charles sat in his gilded cage, aging but never truly growing. His body withered. His voice thinned. He could no longer chew his own food. But his crown remained, propped up by trembling hands. The world waited for him to die. Spain prayed it would not happen yet. And Charles endured. He always endured. As his 30s stretched on, Charles II no longer resembled a monarch in decline. He resembled a relic, one that whispered more about the sins of his ancestors than the state of his empire. Spain was hollowing from within, and so was its king. Inside the walls of the Alcazar, time warped. Hours were measured by medicines. Days blurred under the weight of confession and decay. Charles, now toothless and trembling, still signed royal decrees with a hand that barely obeyed him. His signature had shrunk over the years, like his body, a spider's trail of ink, thinner and shakier with each passing edict. But his mind, that remained a mystery. Some courtiers insisted he was barely aware of his surroundings, a puppet moved by ministers. Others, especially those close to his confessor, feared something more cunning. Charles, they said, had grown quiet not from ignorance, but from watching too long. He knew who plotted and who lied. He recognized the faces that smiled in the morning and betrayed him by supper. And he remembered. Always. His wife, Maria Anna, now wielded increasing power, acting as regent in all but name. She painted herself as loyal, as motherly. But the childless queen was also a Bavarian princess with her own ambitions. Her letters abroad revealed the truth. She wanted her family to inherit Spain. Not because she loved her husband, but because she knew he would not last. Everyone did. France knew it too. Louis XIV began maneuvering, whispering claims through bloodlines, drawing up treaties behind lace and wine. The War of Spanish Succession, though it had not yet begun, already breathed through every diplomatic corridor. And at its center stood the rotting pillar, Charles. He became more devout. He fasted obsessively, believing food was the devil's trap. He spent hours in prayer, kneeling until his knees bled. His hair fell out. His vision darkened. Still he would not die. Still the line held. And the longer he lived, the more desperate the world around him became. They examined him with horror. In one of the final reports by his doctors, a list was compiled of his deformities and ailments. His testicles were described as atrophied, his intestines full of air, his heart the size of a child's. His spine was curved. His limbs weak and brittle. His blood thin. The physicians concluded he had been born dead in body and soul by the sins of his forebears. It was not a diagnosis. It was an obituary waiting to be true. But Charles had one last act. In 1700, he called his council together and made the most consequential decision of his reign. He named his successor. And he chose a Bourbon, Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. The French king's blood would now stake its claim on Spain. It was a final, bitter irony. The Habsburg dynasty, so obsessed with purity and bloodlines, would pass its legacy to its rival. Some saw it as surrender. Others as wisdom. But for Charles, it was neither. It was exhaustion. He could no longer rise without help. He could no longer speak for more than a few minutes. And in those final weeks, surrounded by priests and shadows, he did not ask for his wife. He asked for his dead mother. He saw her in dreams. He claimed she stood at his bed, warning him of fire and smoke and war. He died shortly after, in silence, without a child, without a legacy. His heart, when examined, weighed less than an apple. His brain, swollen and pale, offered no secrets. His jaw remained locked, even in death, a final reminder of a lineage too proud to loosen its grip. Spain mourned. Europe readied for war. But in the end, it was not disease or treachery that destroyed the Habsburgs. It was fidelity. To blood. To ritual. To the illusion that kings could be made perfect if they just married close enough. Charles was their masterpiece, and their punishment. He did not just die. He concluded an experiment in power that had transformed flesh into prophecy. The corpse of Charles II was laid in a gold-threaded shroud, surrounded by incense and silence, but the true mourning began not in the chapel, rather, in the war rooms of Europe. His death was not an ending. It was ignition. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted like dry timber struck by lightning. France moved to claim the throne through Philip of Anjou. Austria howled betrayal. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire entered the fray, not out of grief, but out of calculation. Charles had left behind no heir, but he had left behind a power vacuum so vast, it could not help but collapse into violence. Madrid trembled beneath the boots of foreign soldiers. Cities burned. Colonies rebelled. But none of it, none, was unexpected. Charles's entire reign had been a slow-motion death, not just of a king, but of a system. A lineage that once believed it could outwit nature had now been proven fatally wrong. And the echoes of that hubris were felt in every battlefield and every funeral pyre from the Pyrenees to Peru. But for all the geopolitical fallout, there was something more disturbing, something deeper, quieter, that remained in the minds of those who had truly known him. In private, many who had served Charles for years began to speak more candidly. Not with cruelty, but confusion. They remembered a boy who had clung to the hem of his nursemaid's skirt, even after he was crowned. They remembered a young man who wept uncontrollably at the sight of a caged bird, then hours later signed a death warrant he did not understand. They remembered his terror of being left alone, his desperate prayers, his nights spent whispering to portraits of his ancestors, as though they might answer. Was he cruel? No, they said. Not in the usual way. Not like the kings who reigned before him, with fire and steel. Charles's cruelty came from absence. From the way he had been used as a vessel, an icon with a pulse, nothing more. He had never ruled. He had been ruled through. And yet, something within him had watched it all. Some swore he had grown bitter near the end. That his silence had become strategic. That he began to see his own survival as a kind of revenge, on those who had reduced him to a puppet, and on those waiting for his last breath like dogs before a feast. If that's true, then Charles II was not merely a tragedy. He was a mirror. A mirror that forced Europe to confront what it had built in the name of godliness and continuity. A mirror that showed not power, but paralysis. Not majesty, but the horrifying cost of its maintenance. He had been born into a cage, worshipped as a relic, and embalmed as a caution. But his body, his broken, trembling body, had held empires at bay for nearly 4 decades. And in doing so, he had forced everyone around him to face the consequences of what they had designed. Not all monsters were crowns. But Charles II wore his like a man sinking under its weight. And in that burden, in that grotesque inheritance, he became something more than pitiable. He became unforgettable. Because he was never meant to live that long. Because he was never meant to live at all. In the centuries that followed, historians argued over Charles II, his sanity, his lineage, his significance. Some dismissed him as a grotesque footnote, a failed experiment of royal genetics. Others saw him as the tragic endpoint of medieval thinking in an age lurching toward modernity. But buried beneath these scholarly arguments was something harder to pin down, the unease he left behind. Not just at what he was, but what he revealed. For when you stripped away the incense and tapestries, when you looked past the altar boys and royal seals, you were left with a single, unsettling question: how much of Charles's suffering had been avoidable? And worse, how much of it had been desired? He had not been born to rule. He had been bred to preserve. To keep the Habsburg line unbroken, even if that meant breaking the child who bore it. They had scoured their own family trees for purity and found rot instead. But even as that rot took shape in Charles's face, in his limbs, in his failing organs, they did not stop. They praised his birth as divine. They called his silence wisdom. They turned his deformities into symbols of piety. The court did not merely tolerate his suffering. It sanctified it. And in doing so, they robbed him of any true chance at being either monster or saint. He became a blank space others projected onto: king, curse, puppet, prophecy. But what would it have felt like to be him? To sit on a throne surrounded by whispers, never knowing if the laughter down the hall was about your latest seizure. To sign decrees with hands too frail to lift a goblet. To marry twice, yet die untouched. To pray so fervently for health that you forgot how to ask for happiness. To be the symbol of a nation's fate, and yet never be allowed to decide your own. Even in his final days, those around him still believed he might be cured. They fed him relics. They summoned priests. They offered him saints' bones and virgin blood. But no one gave him truth. No one said what needed to be said, that he had never been a king at all. Only a vessel. Only a mirror of all their worst ambitions. And in that sense, Charles II became more than a victim. He became the perfect ruler for a decaying empire, hollow, haunted, and entirely made of the past. The Spanish Habsburgs died with him, but their logic did not. Even now, the echoes remain. How many dynasties, how many families, how many nations still worship their own reflection? Still trade the future for the illusion of control? Still believe that by keeping bloodlines, ideologies, or myths pure, they can somehow escape the entropy that claimed Charles? It would be comforting to remember him simply as a sad boy in a too large crown. But that would be a lie. Because Charles II's life is not just a tragedy. It is a warning. A whisper from the past that reminds us. What we preserve out of fear may one day become what destroys us. He was the last of his kind. But if we are not careful, he won't be the last of his shadow. What if he had lived longer? How much worse could it have become?